Welcome to Carve Awesome Pumpkins. I'm Christy Speech. I've been carving pumpkins since I was a kid, but it's only been since 2008 that I've carved more than the standard triangle eyes and mouth jack-o'-lantern. I now carve patterns that involve both cutout and shading, which we'll talk about in this video. This will be the only video of my series that applies to both real pumpkins from the farm and foam pumpkins you can get from the craft stores. So let's get started. There are two types of patterns. There are cutout patterns, and in these patterns, every piece is removed completely from the pumpkin, which allows the light to shine through, and that's how you get your design. The other kind is called shaded patterns, and these patterns are a little bit more advanced because some areas you do not cut all the way through the pumpkin. You just shave off some of the skin in the case of real pumpkins, or paint and foam in the case of the foam pumpkins. As you can see with the shaded patterns, you can get some more detail, some more photorealistic carvings, and fancier items. So let's get started. We're going to talk about the cutout patterns first, because they're generally where people will start, although you can start with shaded patterns. There's no reason why you have to start with a cutout pattern. Shaded patterns, they're not really that much harder than cutout patterns, depending on the pattern that you choose. They just take, a little more time. So here are some pumpkins that I have cut out, that I have carved from cutout patterns. Some of these are real pumpkins, some of these are the foam pumpkins, and as you can see, all of the pieces are cut out, and there's a uniform lighting coming through those pieces, so you get kind of a two-tone design, a two-tone pattern that makes your design. So how do you read cutout patterns? Well, they're very simple. This is an example of a free pattern from stonykins.com. You can see the butterfly pattern, and then in the corner is a picture of what it will look like when it's carved. So all you do for cutout patterns is cut out the shapes that you see on the pattern. It really doesn't get any easier than that. You're just going to trace over the lines, and I will show you step by step how to do that in the next upcoming lessons. And you cut all the way through the pumpkin, let those pieces fall out, and then you will have your pattern, and this is a preview of what it will look like. Again, with the cutout patterns, you're going to get a consistent light coloring coming through the pumpkin. Now, cutouts don't always mean that they're easy. A lot of cutout patterns are fairly easy, but there's some like this Spider-Man, also from stonykins.com, which are a bit more challenging, require more patience and a steadier hand. What makes this pattern hard is some of the cutout areas are very small, and especially the little tiny spaces between the cutout areas. You see the dark orange lines between the yellow squares on Spider-Man's suit there. You need to be very patient and careful when carving a pattern like this, because if you cut through one of those tiny lines, your pattern is not going to come out the way that it should. When you're carving, especially cutout patterns, but in all patterns, you always want to check over the pattern before you start carving. There's nothing worse than being in the middle of a carve and realize that the pattern you have is going to fall apart. You especially want to check free patterns that you download. Most patterns that you purchase, the pattern creator will know to check for these kind of things, but mistakes always happen. Some of these guys are putting out hundreds and hundreds of patterns every year, and they do not carve every one before they release the pattern. So you always just want to check it out and make sure it's okay. What do I mean by checking out and making sure it's okay? You want to verify there are no isolated, uncut pieces. And I'll show you an example of this. check out this A. Now, if you were to cut out the gray area on this A out of a pumpkin, you would lose that piece that's colored in red right there because there's nothing holding it to the rest of the pumpkin. So anytime that you have a white area or an uncarved area in a pattern that's completely surrounded by cut out pieces, that pattern is not going to work and you're going to lose that piece. This especially happens with letters because letters often have a completely enclosed area, such as this A. Usually, if you want to do letters, you either need to make it with a stencil that has bridges, or you're going to do it as a shaded pattern. But this can happen in any pattern, not just letters. So just take a quick look before you start carving, because you don't want to put time into carving and then have your pattern fall apart on you. Now we'll talk about shaded patterns. And here are some of the shaded pumpkins that I've done. Again, both real pumpkins and foam pumpkins. You can see that you get a lot more detail in the carves. You have sort of a three-tone picture going on here where you've got the parts where the pumpkin is left whole and intact with the skin on, the darkest. Where the pieces are completely cut out is the lightest, and then the in-between orange, dark yellow part is where it's shaded. So let's look at an example of some of these types of patterns. This again is a free pattern from stonykins.com. It's a pattern of Derek Jeter, which you may or may not be able to tell from the pattern, but the way that you read shaded patterns, the black areas of the pattern, that's what you're going to cut out completely and take those pieces out. The gray parts of the pattern are the parts that you're going to shave. And by shave or shading, I mean you're going to remove the pumpkin skin, the orange pumpkin skin, and maybe a little bit of the inside flesh or foam if you're doing foam pumpkins, but you're not going to go all the way through. Those pieces of the pumpkin are going to stay there and they will stay intact, but because you've removed the outer skin or the outer paint, they will not glow as brightly as the places where you've completely removed pieces of that pattern. So, and here is a preview of what that Derek Jeter pattern will look like. Again, you can see the areas that are black show up as bright yellow on a carved pumpkin, and the gray show up as orange because that's where you've shaded but not cut all the way through. Again, another pattern from Stonykins, my favorite guy, Han Solo. This is a little bit more detailed shaded pattern, but you do it the exact same way. This is a preview of what the carving will look like. The pattern, again, will be the gray and the black, like we saw on the Derek Jeter in the previous slide. You will cut out the black, shave the gray, exactly like you would do a simpler shaded pattern. A more detailed pattern like this just has smaller areas that you are shading and cutting. Take a little more time, a little more patience, a little more practice. Now you can have patterns that are completely shaded and have no cutout pieces at all, such as this Happy Halloween pattern from Stonykins. I've already showed you an example of the A in this pattern, and how if you were to do this as a cutout pattern, you would lose that piece, and the same would apply to the P's and the E's because they have that completely enclosed area that if you were to cut that out, that piece would fall out. So that's why this is a completely shaded pattern. You can take any cutout pattern and turn it into a completely shaded pattern. And I have done that, and it can make some of the patterns easier to carve. For example, that Spider-Man pattern that we just looked at, if you did that as a shaded pattern instead of a cutout pattern, it would be a lot easier and you would not risk losing some of those little tiny pieces because you would not be cutting through the pumpkin. So any completely cut out pattern you can turn into a completely shaved pattern. However, the reverse is not true. You cannot take a shaded pattern and turn it into a cutout pattern because, like we've mentioned, if you have those areas that are completely enclosed, such as the A in this Happy Halloween, you will lose that inner piece. So you cannot take shaved patterns and turn them into cutout patterns. So, you might be wondering why we're talking about patterns before we're talking about pumpkins. Well, the reason is you're going to want to have an idea of what pattern you want to carve before you choose your pumpkin, because some patterns look better on some types of pumpkins versus others. Now, this mainly applies to real pumpkins because that's where you're going to get the variety in the size and the shape. Some are taller, some are shorter, some are rounder, some are kind of more rectangular. Whereas the foam pumpkins, although there is a variety of sizes and shapes you can choose from, and colors even, they are still pretty standard. And, you know, there's a standard 13-inch size, a standard 9-inch size. So you're going to get a lot less variety in the foam patterns. You can resize the patterns before you print them, and you're going to want to make sure that your pattern is a good size for your pumpkin. And let me give you an example here. This is my Superman carve, which I spent many, many hours on. And it was only after I finished that I learned I should have enlarged the pattern so that it filled more of the pumpkin. Now, this is not a great picture of this carving, but I chose this one because you can kind of see the outline of the pumpkin, and you can see how much uncarved space there is on top of the pattern and some below the pattern. Now, if I had enlarged this pattern before carving it, it would have stretched taller on the pumpkin and wrapped around, and it would have made the city background behind Superman look a little more realistic, and would have Superman pop out a little bit more, and it would not have had quite those rigid lines that make it look like a rectangle. So that was a lesson learned for me, and I'm going to be a little more careful about how I print out my patterns and put them on the pumpkins and match them up to the size of pumpkin. So now that we know about the different types of patterns, where can we get these patterns? I've listed here 4 sites that I have purchased patterns from. I am not affiliated with any of these sites, just a happy customer. And at Stonykins, you can get cutout and shaded patterns. The other 3, JP's Jammin' Pumpkins, Zombie Pumpkins, and Ultimate Pumpkin Stencils, I believe only have cutout patterns available, but they are very good. They are above and beyond your standard triangle jack-o'-lantern faces. And the pumpkins that I have shown you throughout this video have been carved by, the patterns have come from one of these 4 companies. So with Ultimate Pumpkin Stencils, patterns are sold individually or in sets, and I believe the prices started around $3.95 for an individual pattern and then go up from there with the sets, and it is cheaper to buy in sets than the individual patterns, as you would assume. The other 3, Stonykins, JP's Jammin' Pumpkins, and Zombie Pumpkins, sell their patterns on a credit system. And the way this works is the more credits that you buy, the cheaper each individual credit is. And all the patterns are generally 1 credit. So you might spend, say, $25 at one of these sites, but you're going to get probably at least 100 patterns, and they're going to come out to pennies per pattern, which is very economical considering the detail that some of these patterns are. some of these patterns have. There are lots of places you can download free pumpkin patterns. Just Google free pumpkin carving patterns or whatever you happen to be looking for. And some are really good, but just remember you're going to get what you pay for. These 4 sites listed here consistently put out quality patterns, and if you buy one of their patterns, you know you're going to get a good pattern. If you get a free pattern, you definitely want to check it over. Make sure there's no places where you're going to lose a piece of your pattern if it's a cutout pattern. If they have a preview of the pattern available, you're going to want to check that out, because you don't want to invest a lot of time in carving a pumpkin that's just not going to come out. You can also buy patterns in craft stores. Michael's and Joann's and AC Moore's and Hobby Lobby and those kind of stores. They sell the Pumpkin Master patterns in the pattern books, and you'll get several patterns within that book. You can probably also find them at Target and Walmart and those kind of stores. I've seen other specialty pumpkin patterns like Disney patterns with Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse and such. But again, you're probably only going to get cutout patterns with this, which, is fine if that's what you want. Just, if you want the more detailed patterns, you're probably going to have to get them online. Now you have your pattern. What's next? You need the right tools to carve your awesome pumpkins. I have 2 videos detailing the exact tools I use. One is for real pumpkins and one is for foam pumpkins. Also on my website, I have over 40 free patterns that you can download. You can also check out my 2 video series, How to Carve Awesome Pumpkins and How to Carve Awesome Foam Pumpkins, where I'll show you step by step how to carve awesome pumpkins. Thanks for watching.